Picture this. It's midnight in 1147 and Brother Ethelbald, after 6 exhausting hours, just finished perfectly copying the Gospel of Matthew. One tiny ink drop falls from his trembling quill onto the final page. You know what he writes in the margin? "May whoever borrowed my good pen without asking be struck with eternal diarrhea." This isn't a joke, this is a real curse found in medieval manuscripts. Tonight I'm taking you inside the secret world of medieval monks, where copying books wasn't just about holy devotion. It was about petty revenge, bizarre obsessions, and some of the most hilariously human moments in history. Because what these monks left in the margins of their manuscripts will change everything you think you know about the Middle Ages. As you settle into the night, let's step back nearly 900 years to the stone corridors of medieval Europe's greatest monasteries. Forget everything you think you know about peaceful, pious monks quietly copying sacred texts. The reality was far stranger, far more human, and infinitely more entertaining. Inside the scriptoriums, those manuscript copying workshops, hidden deep within monastery walls, a completely different world existed after dark. Here, Brother Ethelbald wasn't just a devoted servant of God, he was a perfectionist, with serious anger management issues, who'd spent 12 long years mastering the art of Carolingian minuscule script. His hands, permanently stained with oak gall ink, could produce letters so precise, they looked like they were carved by angels. But when someone borrowed his favorite quill without permission, well, that's when the medieval equivalent of passive-aggressive post-it notes started appearing in the margins of biblical texts. And Ethelbald wasn't alone. Across Europe, thousands of monks were spending their nights, not just copying the Word of God, but leaving behind a secret record of their frustrations, their rivalries, their bizarre superstitions, and their surprisingly sarcastic sense of humor. These weren't the solemn, spiritually transcendent figures we picture today. These were real people with real personalities, trapped in stone buildings, with nothing but candlelight, cold air, and endless religious texts to copy. And when you're stuck doing the same tedious work for hours on end, surrounded by equally frustrated colleagues, well, things get weird. The evidence is still there, hidden in plain sight, in the margins of manuscripts, housed in libraries from Oxford to the Vatican. Tonight we're going to uncover the secret lives of these medieval scribes, starting with the most competitive, obsessive, and downright strange community of bookworms in human history. Now, to understand just how bizarre things got in these scriptoriums, you need to picture the medieval monastery's copying workshop as something between a modern tech startup and a prison library, but with significantly more religious guilt and considerably worse heating. The scriptorium at Abbey of St. Denis, for instance, housed 43 monks working simultaneously under the watchful eye of the armarius, basically the head librarian who could make or break your entire monastic career with a single disapproving glance at your letter forms. And trust me, Brother Ethelbald had received plenty of those glances over the years. These weren't cozy reading rooms with comfortable chairs and good lighting. We're talking about massive stone halls with wooden lecterns positioned precisely 18 inches apart, because apparently medieval monks needed their personal space just as much as modern office workers, except their HR department consisted of one very stern abbot with a wooden rod for correcting posture. The hierarchy was ruthless and surprisingly sophisticated. Master scribes like Brother Ethelbald, who had earned their status through decades of perfect letter forms and zero spelling mistakes, sat closest to the massive stone fireplace where they could actually feel their fingers during winter months, while novices shivered near the drafty windows, learning that frostbite and calligraphy don't mix well, and illuminators, those artistic prima donnas responsible for decorating initial letters, with elaborate gold leaf and microscopic details, occupied their own special corner where they could throw paintbrush tantrums in relative privacy without disrupting the sacred silence that was supposedly maintained throughout the workspace. Every morning at exactly 4:30, immediately after Laud's prayer and before the sun had even considered making an appearance, the armarius would unlock the precious chest containing the abbey's collection of writing instruments, each quill carefully selected from the left wing of specific goose breeds because medieval monks had developed surprisingly strong opinions about optimal feather aerodynamics, ink absorption rates, and the precise flexibility required for different letter styles, making modern pen preferences look positively casual by comparison. The daily routine was mechanically precise yet spiritually demanding. Arrive at your assigned lectern, genuflect toward the altar, select your writing instruments from the communal supply while silently praying for divine guidance and avoiding ink blots. Spend exactly 3 minutes sharpening your quill to the precise angle dictated by centuries of monastic tradition and the personal preferences of your particular abbey's house style, then begin copying whatever sacred text had been assigned to By the abbot's weekly manuscript production schedule, which was planned with the efficiency of a military campaign. But here's where it gets interesting and where Brother Ethelbald's competitive nature really started to shine. These scriptoriums operated like medieval sweatshops where monks weren't just racing against time and the fading daylight, they were racing against each other in an elaborate system of monastic capitalism. Because completing more pages than Brother Francis from the next lectern over meant better meals, warmer seating arrangements closer to the fire, first pick of the premium vellum, sheets made from the silkiest calfskin, and most importantly, the abbot's favor, which could mean the difference between spending your life copying hymns or getting assigned to copy the really boring administrative documents about grain storage and tax collection. The economics were surprisingly complex and cutthroat. A single complete Bible required the carefully prepared hides of exactly 300 sheep, 6 months of continuous labor from multiple specialized scribes working in coordinated shifts, enough oak gall ink to fill a wine barrel, and more gold leaf than most knights would see in their lifetime, making each completed manuscript worth more than a fully armored warhorse, which explains why monks guarded their work with the intensity of dragons protecting treasure hoards and why the punishment for damaging someone else's manuscript could include weeks of bread and water penance. Silence was supposedly mandatory according to the rule of Saint Benedict, but in reality, these scriptoriums buzzed with a constant, carefully modulated symphony of frustrated sighs, rhythmic quill scratching against parchment, deliberate page-turning, and the occasional muffled curse when someone's hand cramped during a particularly elaborate capital letter. Because despite what church doctrine suggested about spiritual transcendence conquering physical discomfort, medieval monks remained stubbornly human beings with very human limitations, petty jealousies, and surprisingly colorful vocabularies when they thought nobody was listening. If you think modern perfectionists are intense, you've clearly never met a medieval monk obsessed with letter-form consistency, because Brother Ethelbald's dedication to flawless penmanship made modern graphic designers look like casual hobbyists scribbling grocery lists. The pursuit of perfect calligraphy wasn't just a professional requirement, it was a spiritual obsession that consumed these scribes every waking moment, turning them into medieval predecessors of today's most neurotic artists. Except their medium was sacred text and their mistakes could literally damn souls if a miscopied word changed the meaning of scripture. Each monastery developed its own distinctive writing style, passed down through generations like family recipes, with techniques so specific that modern paleographers can identify not just which abbey produced a manuscript, but often which individual monk's hand created each page, because apparently medieval scribes had handwriting as unique as fingerprints, and twice as obsessively protected. Brother Ethelbald had spent his first 7 years as a novice practicing nothing but individual letters, starting with simple vertical strokes that had to be exactly 3 millimeters tall, perfectly parallel, and spaced with mathematical precision, because the Armarius believed that sloppy letter formation reflected a sloppy soul, and nobody wanted to face eternal damnation because their lowercase was asymmetrical. The tools of perfection were treated like holy relics. Each monk's personal quill was carved from specific feather sections, seasoned for exactly 6 months in a mixture of sand and salt, then sharpened daily with knives maintained to surgical precision, while their ink, made from crushed oak galls, iron sulfate, and wine that had been blessed by 3 different priests, was tested on practice vellum every morning to ensure consistent color density and flow characteristics that would remain stable throughout the long copying sessions. Mistakes weren't just discouraged, they were considered evidence of spiritual weakness, which explains why Brother Thomas, the nervous novice who joined the scriptorium 3 months earlier, had developed a facial tic every time he approached a capital letter, knowing that one misplaced flourish could result in weeks of additional prayer, fasting, and the humiliation of having his error displayed on the refectory wall as a cautionary example to other scribes. The competitive atmosphere was suffocating yet strangely motivating. Monks would secretly practice letter combinations late at night by candlelight, developing hand exercises to improve their pen control, and some even resorted to creating elaborate warm-up routines involving finger stretches, wrist rotations, and breathing techniques that wouldn't look out of place in a modern yoga studio, all in pursuit of achieving the legendary status of master scribe that came with better food, private quarters, and the ultimate prize of being assigned to copy the most prestigious texts instead of endless psalters and administrative documents. Quality control was ruthless and systematic. The Armarius conducted daily inspections using a magnifying glass made from polished crystal, measuring letter heights with rulers accurate to fractions of millimeters, checking line spacing with specially designed calipers, and examining each page under different lighting conditions to detect the slightest irregularities in ink density, letter slant, or spacing consistency that might compromise the manuscript's spiritual and monetary value. But here's where the obsession became truly bizarre. Some monks developed superstitious rituals around their writing process, like Brother Benedict, who refused to begin copying on cloudy days because he believed natural light affected his letter forms, or Master Illuminator Hugh, who insisted on wearing the same unwashed robe for months because he was convinced that changing clothes would alter his brush control, creating a culture where artistic excellence became indistinguishable from religious mania, and where the pursuit of perfect penmanship transformed ordinary men into obsessive-compulsive perfectionists who would spend hours redoing entire pages because a single letter didn't meet their impossibly high standards. Brother Ethelbald's transformation from merely perfectionist to legendary scriptorium warrior began on a particularly cold February morning in 1151, when Brother Godwin, a smug Benedictine transfer from the prestigious Abbey of Cluny, had the audacity to publicly critique Ethelbald's lowercase g formation during the weekly manuscript review, suggesting that perhaps the provincial scribes of their humble monastery might benefit from observing, quote, proper continental letter construction techniques, which was basically medieval monk speak for calling someone a talentless amateur in front of their professional peers. What Godwin couldn't have known, because he was too busy admiring his own elaborate flourishes and pontificating about French writing traditions, was that Ethelbald had spent the previous decade developing a reputation as the most meticulous scribe in 3 counties, with letter forms so precise that visiting scholars regularly requested manuscripts specifically copied by his hand, and bishops had been known to commission entire psalters based solely on samples of his work, making Godwin's casual dismissal not just insulting but professionally catastrophic. The challenge was issued with the subtlety of a medieval diplomatic incident. Godwin announced that he would demonstrate superior technique by copying the Book of Psalms using the fashionable Caroline minuscule script from his previous monastery, completing it faster and with greater accuracy than any local scribe could manage, essentially throwing down a literary gauntlet that echoed through the scriptorium like a declaration of war, because in the intensely competitive world of monastic manuscript production, questioning someone's penmanship was equivalent to questioning their spiritual worth, intellectual capacity, and basic human dignity all at once. Ethelbald accepted this challenge with the calm dignity of a master craftsman who'd just been insulted by an overconfident apprentice. But privately, he began planning a response that would not only vindicate his reputation but establish once and for all that technical skill without local knowledge was like trying to perform surgery with fancy foreign instruments while blindfolded. The weapons of choice were revealing. Godwin selected the prestigious Psalm 119, the longest chapter in the entire Bible with its 176 verses of repetitive Hebrew poetry, clearly believing that quantity would demonstrate his supposed superiority, while Ethelbald chose the infinitely more challenging Book of Job, with its complex theological arguments, varied sentence structures, and notorious difficulties in maintaining consistent letter forms across dramatically different textual styles, essentially choosing quality and technical complexity over flashy volume. The rules were established by the armarius with the solemnity of a judicial proceeding. Both monks would begin at dawn following Laud's prayer, work until sunset each day, take identical meal breaks, use identical materials provided by the abbey stores, and submit their completed work for evaluation by a panel consisting of the abbot, 2 visiting scholars from distant monasteries, and Brother Marcus, the elderly former armarius whose knowledge of letter form standards was considered infallible. Throughout the region, for 3 weeks, the entire scriptorium operated under the tension of this escalating competition, with other monks placing informal wagers on the outcome, novices sneaking glances at both scribes' progress during prayer breaks, and even the usually oblivious kitchen staff asking detailed questions about the contestants' daily page counts, creating an atmosphere that transformed routine monastic life into something resembling a medieval reality show where the prize was professional respect and the penalty was lifelong humiliation. But what started as a simple challenge quickly evolved into psychological warfare. Godwin began arriving at the scriptorium 15 minutes early each morning, making elaborate shows of sharpening his quills and arranging his materials with theatrical precision designed to intimidate his opponent, while Ethelbald responded by working so quietly and efficiently that other monks began gathering to watch his seemingly effortless letter formation, creating an audience that turned daily copying sessions into public performances where every pen stroke was scrutinized for evidence of superiority or weakness. While Brother Ethelbald and Godwin waged their war of letter forms, both men remained bound by the most elaborate, petty, and downright ridiculous set of workplace regulations ever devised by human bureaucracy, because medieval monasteries didn't just have rules about copying manuscripts, They had rules about the rules, subclauses about the subclauses, and penalties so specific they covered scenarios most people couldn't imagine in their wildest nightmares. The Regula Scriptorum, as these guidelines were pompously called, ran to 47 pages of densely written Latin that covered everything from acceptable quill sharpening angles, to the precise number of letter strokes permitted before mandatory hand washing, to the theologically appropriate responses when discovering errors in previously copied religious texts, creating a bureaucratic maze that would make modern corporate compliance departments weep with envy. Rule number 12, for instance, stipulated that scribes could only use their left hand to turn pages, because the right hand was reserved exclusively for holding writing instruments, and violating this seemingly arbitrary distinction resulted in 3 days of additional prayer and the loss of evening meal privileges, which explains why new novices spent their first months developing ambidextrous page-turning skills while trying to maintain perfect posture and flawless letter forms. Simultaneously, the regulations governing mistakes were particularly Byzantine. Minor errors, defined as single incorrect letters that didn't change word meanings, required immediate confession to the armarius, followed by the ritual scratching out of the offending character using a specially blessed knife, then careful insertion of the correction using ink that had been mixed with holy water and blessed salt, because apparently God cared deeply about proofreading techniques and wouldn't accept casual, editorial corrections on sacred texts. More serious errors, such as accidentally writing heretical statements or completely wrong words that could mislead future readers about crucial theological concepts, triggered what the rule called the penance of prostration, which involved lying face down on the cold stone floor for exactly 1 hour while reciting specific psalms, followed by recopying the entire page from scratch using materials purchased with the offending scribe's personal meal allowance, essentially finding monks there. Dinner for theological typos. The most absurd regulations dealt with seasonal copying restrictions. During Lent, scribes were forbidden from using colored inks except for the most sacred feast days, because apparently bright colors distracted from proper spiritual contemplation, while summer months brought the bizarre requirement that all copying must cease during thunderstorms, not for practical reasons like protecting manuscripts from rain damage, but because the church had decided that lightning represented divine displeasure with human intellectual activity, making it spiritually dangerous to continue writing during heavenly electrical displays. Brother Ethelbald had memorized every single regulation during his novice years, not from dedication to monastic discipline, but from pure survival instinct, because the punishments escalated with mathematical precision. First offense meant extra prayers, second offense added fasting, third offense included manual labor in the abbey's gardens, and fourth offense could result in temporary expulsion from the scriptorium, which for a professional scribe was equivalent to career suicide, social disgrace, and spiritual failure all rolled into one devastatingly effective deterrent. The daily schedule was regulated down to the minute. Scribes began work exactly 15 minutes after Laud's prayer, took their first break precisely 2 hours later for exactly 12 minutes of silent reflection, resumed copying until the midday meal which lasted exactly 30 minutes, returned to work for the afternoon session which continued until exactly 1 hour before Vespers, at which point all writing materials had to be cleaned, blessed, and stored according to a specific ritual that took another 20 minutes to complete properly, creating a timetable so rigid that modern factory workers would consider it oppressive. Perhaps the strangest rule involved the doctrine of spiritual contamination, which held that scribes who had committed sins, even minor ones like eating too quickly or harboring jealous thoughts about fellow monks, could spiritually pollute the sacred text they were copying, requiring them to undergo ritual purification involving confession, additional prayers, and symbolic washing of hands with water that had been blessed by the abbot himself, because medieval religious authorities believed that moral impurity could literally transfer through quill pens into manuscript pages, making every copying session a potential theological minefield where personal failings could contaminate centuries of preserved wisdom. Just when the scriptorium tension couldn't possibly escalate further, Abbot Godfrey, a thin, sharp-featured man with the temperament of a frustrated accountant and the authority of an absolute monarch, decided that the ongoing competition between Brother Ethelbald and Godwin provided the perfect opportunity to implement what he called the Divine Quality Assurance Protocol, which was essentially medieval micromanagement disguised as spiritual supervision, and which would make the existing regulations look positively lenient by comparison. Godfrey had arrived at the abbey 3 years earlier from the notoriously strict Carthusian order, bringing with him revolutionary ideas about manuscript perfection that he developed during his previous position overseeing the royal scriptorium, where a single spelling error could result in political embarrassment, diplomatic incidents, or worse, and where he'd earned a reputation as the most demanding supervisor in Christendom, capable of detecting flaws that other experts couldn't find even with magnifying lenses. His new inspection system was diabolically comprehensive. Instead of the traditional weekly manuscript reviews, Godfrey instituted hourly quality checks, appearing at random intervals throughout each day like a literary nightmare, armed with measuring instruments, color comparison charts, and a specially designed magnifying device that could reveal the slightest inconsistencies in letter formation, ink density, or spacing regularity, turning every moment of copying into a potential audit that could destroy months of careful work with a single disapproving observation. The physical inspections were conducted with surgical precision. Godfrey would approach each scribe's lectern carrying a leather satchel filled with specialized tools, including calipers for measuring letter heights, rulers marked in increments smaller than human hair width, glass lenses that magnified text to enormous proportions, and color wheels that helped him detect even microscopic variations in ink consistency, creating a quality control process that would impress modern manufacturing executives and terrify anyone who'd ever made a typo. Brother Ethelbald, already stressed by his ongoing competition with Godwin, now faced the additional nightmare of random inspections that could occur during the most delicate phases of his work, like when he was executing complex capital letters or navigating the intricate theological passages of the Book of Job, where a moment's distraction could result not only in ruined letter forms but also in theological errors that might require weeks of correction, penance, and professional humiliation. The psychological pressure was intentionally crushing. Godfrey had developed a rating system that classified manuscript quality into 7 categories ranging from divinely inspired, at the highest level, to spiritually contaminated, at the lowest, with each rating carrying specific consequences for the scribe's daily privileges, meal portions, sleeping arrangements, and most importantly, future work assignments, because being labeled spiritually contaminated could mean spending the rest of your monastic career copying grain inventory lists instead of sacred scriptures. The inspection process itself was designed to maximize anxiety. Godfrey would arrive silently, position himself directly behind the working scribe, remain motionless for several minutes while examining the work in progress, then begin his evaluation with a series of increasingly specific questions about letter formation techniques, ink preparation methods, and the scribe's spiritual state during the copying process, all while taking detailed notes in a private ledger that would determine the monk's professional fate, creating an atmosphere where every pen stroke became a performance under scrutiny. What made these inspections particularly terrifying was Godfrey's uncanny ability to detect problems that seemed invisible to everyone else. He could spot a letter that was 1 degree off vertical, identify ink that had been mixed with slightly too much water, or notice spacing irregularities that required mathematical instruments to measure, leading other monks to whisper that he possessed supernatural vision, divine insight, or possibly diabolic powers that allowed him to perceive flaws beyond normal human perception. The competition between Ethelbald and Godwin, already intense enough to disrupt the entire monastery's routine, now operated under this additional layer of extreme oversight, with both scribes knowing that their public battle for supremacy was being evaluated not just by their peers and the traditional judging panel, but by an abbot whose standards were so impossibly high that even master scribes from other monasteries had been known to fail his inspections, creating a scenario where professional rivalry met bureaucratic perfectionism in what was rapidly becoming the most stressful workplace environment in medieval Europe. Fast forward to 1923, when Oxford librarian Dr. Edmund Craster was cataloging medieval manuscripts and discovered something that would revolutionize our understanding of medieval monks forever. Dozens of sarcastic, bitter, and downright hilarious comments written in tiny script along the margins of supposedly sacred texts, revealing that medieval scribes had been using holy books as their personal diaries, complaint departments, and revenge platforms for centuries. These marginalia, as scholars call them, weren't random doodles or accidental marks. They were deliberate, often elaborate messages left by frustrated monks who couldn't voice their opinions aloud but could certainly write them in spaces where future readers might stumble across their uncensored thoughts about everything from terrible food to incompetent abbots to annoying fellow monks who apparently snored too loudly during midnight prayers. Brother Marcus from Canterbury Cathedral, for example, left this gem in a 12th century psalter. "The parchment is hairy, the ink is thin, the weather is cold, and my hand aches. I cannot see properly, and this vellum is definitely cursed by demons," followed immediately by a tiny drawing of what appears to be a very rude gesture directed at whoever would read his complaint, proving that medieval customer service reviews existed centuries before Yelp. At Lindisfarne Monastery, one anonymous scribe interrupted his copying of the Gospel of Luke to write, "Brother Aldred borrowed my best quill pen 6 months ago and still hasn't returned it. May his writing hand develop permanent tremors and may all his letters look like drunk spiders," which was basically the medieval equivalent of a passive-aggressive text message, except it was preserved in a religious manuscript for posterity to judge. The variety of complaints was staggering. "This ink freezes before I can finish a word," complained one monk during a particularly harsh winter at York Minster, while another at Durham Cathedral wrote, "Whoever keeps moving my bookmark will face divine retribution, and also I know where you sleep," demonstrating that even in medieval monasteries, office supply theft was a serious workplace issue that could drive holy men to threats of supernatural vengeance. Some marginalia revealed surprising personality. Brother Thomas from Glastonbury Abbey drew elaborate illustrations of cats chasing mice throughout his copy of St. Augustine's Confessions, apparently because he was either deeply bored by theological philosophy or secretly believed that religious texts needed more entertainment value, while a monk at Bury St. Edmunds left detailed weather reports spanning 3 years, including observations like, "Tuesday, raining again, my arthritis is acting up." Brother Geoffrey's cooking somehow got worse, creating an accidental historical record of both meteorology and monastic cafeteria quality. The most shocking discoveries came from Irish monasteries, where scribes apparently felt free to express opinions that would have scandalized their continental colleagues. The abbot's nephew couldn't spell his own name if his salvation depended on it, yet here he is copying the Book of Revelations, wrote one particularly bold monk at Clonmacnoise, while another added, "I've seen more intelligence in the sheep we use for parchment," demonstrating that nepotism and workplace incompetence were universal human experiences that transcended both centuries and religious vows of humility. These secret messages transformed our entire understanding of medieval monastic life, revealing that beneath the surface of solemn religious dedication lay a vibrant community of real people dealing with the same petty frustrations, personality conflicts, and workplace drama that plague modern offices, except their complaints were preserved in documents that would survive for nearly 1,000 years, ensuring that future generations could appreciate the timeless human capacity for creative, passive aggression and the universal need to document just how annoying our co-workers can be when we're stuck with them for decades in the same building. Fast forward to 1156, when what started as professional competition between individual monks escalated into the medieval equivalent of corporate espionage, as monasteries across Europe began stealing each other's manuscript techniques, poaching talented scribes, and engaging in deliberate sabotage that would make modern business rivalries look like friendly neighborhood disputes, because apparently religious devotion couldn't overcome the basic human desire to prove your workplace was superior to everyone else's workplace. The Abbey of Cluny, with its reputation for producing the most luxurious illuminated manuscripts in France, had become the medieval equivalent of a prestigious design firm, attracting wealthy patrons who were willing to pay premium prices for books that were essentially medieval status symbols, which naturally infuriated competing monasteries who watched potential commissions and donations flowing toward their rival instead of supporting their own communities of equally devoted, if less famous, scribes. Brother William of Malmesbury documented the most notorious incident. Monks from Fleury Abbey disguised themselves as traveling merchants and spent 3 weeks at Cluny, pretending to be interested in purchasing manuscripts while actually memorizing their rivals' techniques, studying their ink formulations, sketching their distinctive letter forms, and even stealing samples of their specially prepared vellum to reverse engineer the preparation process back at their own monastery. The theft was discovered when one of the Fleury spies was caught measuring the spacing between letters on a Cluny psalter using a piece of string marked with precise intervals, leading to a diplomatic incident that required intervention from the Bishop of Autun and resulted in a formal treaty establishing rules for intermonastic manuscript viewing that read like modern corporate non-disclosure agreements. Canterbury Cathedral fought back against continental competition by developing what they called the English style of illumination, which featured distinctively different color palettes, unique decorative motifs, and letter forms that were deliberately designed to be impossible for foreign monasteries to replicate without years of specialized training, essentially creating medieval trade secrets that were guarded as carefully as military intelligence. The rivalry reached absurd heights when Monte Cassino, the mother house of the Benedictine order, began spreading rumors that manuscripts produced in northern European monasteries were spiritually inferior because the cold climate affected ink quality and made scribes too hurried in their work, while English monasteries retaliated by claiming that Italian manuscripts were corrupted by excessive decoration that distracted from the sacred text, turning theological debate into a thinly disguised marketing war. Economic warfare soon followed intellectual competition. Wealthy patrons began commissioning identical texts from multiple monasteries simultaneously, then comparing the results before deciding which community deserved payment, creating a system where religious communities were forced to compete for survival like medieval freelancers bidding against each other for the same contract. Except the consequences of losing included not just financial hardship but potential closure of centuries-old institutions. The most dramatic escalation occurred when St. Denis Abbey hired Brother Anselm, a master illuminator who had trained at Cluny, offering him better living conditions, superior materials, and exemption from certain monastic duties in exchange for recreating Cluny's signature techniques for their own manuscripts, essentially poaching talent in a move that violated both written agreements between the abbeys and unwritten codes of monastic honor, leading to accusations of corruption, spiritual bankruptcy, and betrayal that echoed through ecclesiastical courts for decades. Some monasteries resorted to industrial espionage that would impress modern corporations, sending novices to train at rival institutions with secret instructions to memorize every detail of their hosts' processes, planting informants who would report on new techniques or major commissions, and even bribing servants and suppliers to reveal information about competitors' projects, materials, and wealthy patrons, creating intelligence networks that operated across national boundaries and religious hierarchies. The psychological warfare became equally sophisticated, with monasteries deliberately timing the completion of major manuscripts to coincide with their rivals' important projects, announcing commissions in ways designed to steal attention from competitors, and spreading rumors about the quality, authenticity, or spiritual worthiness of manuscripts produced by other communities, essentially turning medieval religious institutions into competing brands fighting for market share in the luxury manuscript industry. Brother Thomas had always been the nervous type, jumping at shadows and crossing himself whenever ravens gathered near the abbey windows, but when he volunteered to complete the mysterious half-finished manuscript that had been discovered in Brother Edmund's cell after the old monk's sudden death, nobody at Rievaulx Abbey could have predicted that the project would nearly destroy the young scribe's sanity and create what became known throughout Yorkshire as the most cursed book in English monastic history. The manuscript itself seemed innocent enough at first glance, a beautifully illuminated copy of the Book of Revelation that Edmund had been working on for 3 years, featuring elaborate apocalyptic imagery with dragons, seven-headed beasts, and angels wielding flaming swords. But as Thomas began studying the existing work to match Edmund's distinctive style, he noticed disturbing details that hadn't been visible during casual inspection by the armarius. The marginalia was wrong, completely wrong in ways that made Thomas's skin crawl. Instead of the usual complaints about cold weather or borrowed pens, Edmund had filled every available space with increasingly frantic notes written in a script that grew more erratic with each page, starting with normal observations like, "The ink flows strangely today," but gradually deteriorating into desperate scrawls warning about voices in the vellum, and letters that move when nobody watches, and finally, most chilling of all, repeated phrases claiming, "The words write themselves now, God help me, the words write themselves." Thomas initially dismissed these oddities as evidence that Brother Edmund had suffered from some form of mental decline before his death, but when he began actually working on the manuscript, continuing Edmund's apocalyptic illustrations and copying the remaining verses from Revelation, strange things started happening that couldn't be explained by nervous imagination or insufficient lighting. His quills kept breaking at crucial moments, always during the most theologically significant passages, and no matter how carefully he prepared his ink, it would inexplicably change consistency while he worked, sometimes becoming so thick it wouldn't flow properly, other times becoming so thin it created ugly blots that ruined hours of careful lettering, forcing him to scrape away mistakes and start over repeatedly, as if the manuscript itself was fighting against completion. The most unsettling incidents occurred during the night copying sessions when Thomas worked alone by candlelight. Shadows seemed to move independently of the flickering flames, creating the illusion that the illuminated demons and apocalyptic beasts were shifting position when he wasn't looking directly at them, and sometimes he could swear he heard whispers in Latin coming from the parchment itself, though when he stopped working to listen carefully, the sounds would immediately cease, leaving only silence broken by his own rapid breathing and pounding heartbeat. Other monks began avoiding Thomas during meals, claiming he looked haggard and spoke to himself constantly, muttering about problems with his work that became increasingly incoherent and frightening. He complained about letters that wouldn't stay where he placed them, about illuminated figures that seemed to watch him while he worked, and most disturbing of all, about dreams where Brother Edmund appeared to warn him that the manuscript must never be completed because it contained something that shouldn't exist in the world, something that had been hidden in the text through a combination of Edmund's failing mind and genuinely supernatural influence. The breaking point came during the Feast of St. Michael, when Thomas was found unconscious in the scriptorium at dawn, surrounded by pages covered in writing that nobody recognized, certainly not Thomas's careful script or Edmund's deteriorating hand, but something else entirely. Symbols that resembled letters but couldn't be read, arranged in patterns that hurt the eyes to examine closely, and most unnervingly, fresh ink that was still wet despite the fact that Thomas had been unconscious. 4 hours and his writing materials were untouched across the room. The abbot ordered the manuscript destroyed immediately, but even the fire seemed reluctant to consume Edmund's work, requiring multiple attempts with blessed oil and holy water before the cursed pages finally burned completely, while Thomas spent 6 months in prayer and meditation before he recovered enough to return to copying simple psalters, though he never again volunteered for projects involving apocalyptic literature and would visibly tremble whenever anyone mentioned the book of Revelation in his presence. The incident at Revo Abbey wasn't an isolated case of monastic paranoia, because across medieval Europe, scribes had developed an elaborate system of superstitions surrounding their writing materials that would make modern conspiracy theorists seem perfectly reasonable by comparison, with beliefs so bizarre and specific that they governed every aspect of manuscript production from the initial preparation of parchment to the final blessing of completed texts. At Fountains Abbey, Brother Gregory refused to use ink that had been mixed during thunderstorms, convinced that lightning-charged air would cause the letters to fade within 7 years, while his colleague Brother Philip insisted that vellum prepared from animals that had died during eclipses carried spiritual contamination that could corrupt any text written upon it, leading to elaborate records tracking the exact dates and celestial conditions surrounding every aspect of their supply chain. The superstitions varied wildly between regions and religious orders. Irish monks believed that adding 3 drops of holy water from specific sacred wells would prevent their ink from freezing during winter copying sessions, while Cistercian communities swore that parchment should never be prepared by monks who had eaten meat within the previous 40 days, because animal consumption somehow transferred spiritual impurity through the craftsman's hands into the writing surface, creating dietary restrictions that went far beyond normal monastic fasting requirements. Brother Aldrich of Whitby Abbey had catalogued over 200 different beliefs about ink preparation alone, ranging from the relatively sensible idea that certain oak galls produced more durable writing to the completely insane conviction that ink mixed by left-handed monks would cause readers to develop heretical thoughts, leading to discrimination against southpaw scribes that persisted for centuries despite having absolutely no theological basis in any official church doctrine. The most widespread superstition involved what monks called death parchment, vellum prepared from animals that had died of disease rather than being slaughtered for food, which was believed to carry the spiritual essence of suffering and could allegedly transmit physical ailments to anyone who spent extended periods writing upon it, creating a black market for blessed vellum from animals that had been ritually slaughtered by priests specifically for manuscript production, with premium prices charged for parchment that came with certificates of spiritual purity. Some monasteries developed elaborate blessing rituals for their writing materials that consumed hours of daily prayers. The Abbey of St. Wandreau required all quills to be individually blessed by 3 different monks before use, while Corby Abbey insisted that ink could only be mixed during specific phases of the moon and had to be stirred exactly 49 times in a clockwise direction while reciting particular psalms, creating supply bottlenecks that significantly slowed manuscript production but were considered essential for preventing spiritual contamination of sacred texts. The most paranoid communities established detailed genealogical records for their parchment supplies, tracking not just which animals had provided the skin but also their breeding history, diet, health conditions, and even the moral character of their owners, because some monks genuinely believed that vellum from animals owned by sinful farmers would carry spiritual pollution that could corrupt religious manuscripts, leading to investigations that resembled modern forensic accounting more than medieval religious practice. Brother Eustace of Canterbury became famous throughout England for his ability to identify cursed writing materials by smell alone, claiming he could detect parchment that had been prepared during inappropriate astrological conditions, ink that had been contaminated by secular thoughts during mixing, or quills that had been plucked from birds that had died unnatural deaths, services for which wealthy monasteries would pay substantial consulting fees despite the complete lack of evidence supporting his supernatural detection abilities. The economic impact of these superstitions was staggering. Monasteries would reject entire shipments of expensive materials based on minor theological concerns. Scribes would abandon nearly completed manuscripts if they discovered their parchment had supposed spiritual defects, And some communities spent more money on blessing ceremonies and purity verification than they did on the actual writing supplies themselves, creating a secondary economy of religious material authentication that employed dozens of specialist monks whose only job was determining whether writing supplies met impossibly strict spiritual standards that changed depending on local traditions, seasonal religious requirements, and the personal paranoia of individual abbots. Master Hugh of St. Albans was officially the most skilled illuminator in 3 kingdoms, capable of creating marginalia so intricate that visiting bishops would spend hours examining his work with magnifying lenses. But unofficially he was also the most subversive artist in medieval Christianity, using his prestigious position to smuggle unauthorized imagery into sacred manuscripts with such cleverness that his rebellious decorations went undetected for decades, creating what modern art historians now recognize as one of the earliest examples of systematic artistic resistance to religious censorship. His specialty was hiding secular, pagan, and occasionally blasphemous images within the elaborate borders and initial letters of psalters and gospels, camouflaging dancing peasants as praying angels, transforming biblical prophets into recognizable portraits of local nobles he despised, and most scandalously, incorporating ancient Celtic fertility symbols into Christmas manuscripts commissioned by the strictest church authorities who remained completely oblivious to the pagan iconography surrounding their sacred texts. The technique required extraordinary skill and nerves of steel. Hugh would begin each illumination with perfectly orthodox religious imagery that satisfied any casual inspection, but then add layers of increasingly subtle details that revealed alternative meanings to anyone who knew what to look for, like the famous St. Matthew manuscript where the evangelist's halo contains tiny figures engaged in distinctly non-religious activities, or the Easter Psalter where the resurrection scene includes background characters whose poses spell out rude Latin words when viewed from specific angles. Hugh's masterpiece of hidden rebellion was a commissioned book of hours for Lady Matilda of Wessex, a notoriously pious woman who had donated enormous sums to the monastery specifically for the creation of the most spiritually pure illuminated prayers available, but who unknowingly received a manuscript where every single page contained at least one disguised reference to pre-Christian British mythology, from druids cleverly disguised as biblical patriarchs to ancient stone circles camouflaged as Jerusalem architecture, creating a pagan prayer book that Lady Matilda treasured as the pinnacle of Christian devotion and displayed proudly to visiting clergy who praised its obvious holiness. The discovery of Hugh's secret artistic rebellion came through pure accident when Brother Anselm, the new assistant librarian with an unfortunate tendency toward obsessive detail analysis, noticed that the lamb in Hugh's Agnus Dei illustration had facial features remarkably similar to Abbot Geoffrey, complete with the abbot's distinctive receding hairline and perpetually disapproving expression, leading to closer examination that revealed an entire menagerie of abbey personnel disguised as biblical livestock throughout Hugh's supposedly sacred bestiary. The investigation that followed was both theological crisis and art historical detective work. Scholars spent months cataloging Hugh's hidden meanings, discovering that over 15 years of illuminated manuscripts contained systematic mockery of church hierarchy, political commentary on contemporary events, personal revenge against monks who had slighted him, and most shocking of all, detailed anatomical studies of human and animal bodies that had been gathered through decidedly non-religious observation of local farmers, merchants, and their livestock during Hugh's supposedly prayer-focused afternoon walks through the surrounding countryside. Hugh's defense was a masterpiece of medieval artistic manifesto. He argued that God had created the natural world in all its complexity and diversity, therefore excluding any aspect of divine creation from religious art was itself a form of heresy, while his incorporation of local faces and familiar landscapes helped viewers connect more personally with sacred stories, essentially claiming that his subversive decorations were actually more spiritually beneficial than traditional generic religious imagery that failed to speak to contemporary believers living in specific places with specific concerns. The church authorities faced a dilemma that exposed the fundamental contradiction between artistic excellence and religious control. Hugh's technical skills were so extraordinary that destroying his work would eliminate some of the finest illuminated manuscripts ever created, while his theological arguments were sophisticated enough to confuse even learned bishops who weren't entirely sure whether his creative interpretations constituted dangerous heresy or innovative spiritual insight that deserved protection rather than punishment. The compromise solution was typically medieval in its bureaucratic complexity. Hugh was allowed to continue illuminating manuscripts under closer supervision, His existing works were reviewed by theological committees that approved most of his imagery while ordering specific modifications to the most obviously problematic details, and future commissions would require preliminary sketches approved by both the armarius and a specially appointed theological advisor, essentially creating the medieval equivalent of an institutional review board for artistic expression that satisfied nobody but prevented the complete loss of Hugh's irreplaceable talents. The year 1187 marked not only Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem but also the outbreak of what chroniclers would later call the Bellum Literarum, the War of Letters, when a seemingly innocent theological debate about proper scriptural presentation exploded into a continent-wide conflict that pitted the traditional Carolingian minuscule script against the emerging Gothic lettering style, creating battle lines that divided monasteries, destroyed centuries-old alliances, and ultimately required papal intervention to prevent the complete breakdown of European manuscript production. The conflict began when Cardinal Alberic of Ostia commissioned identical copies of the newly translated works of Aristotle from both Rheims Cathedral, famous for their classical Carolingian letter forms, and the progressive Abbey of St. Denis, where scribes had begun experimenting with the dramatic vertical strokes and compressed spacing that would become known as Gothic script, intending to compare the results as part of his scholarly research into optimal textual presentation for philosophical works. When both manuscripts arrived at the Vatican simultaneously in March 1187, the cardinal's innocent academic exercise triggered a diplomatic incident that escalated far beyond anyone's expectations. Supporters of Carolingian script argued that the rounded, spacious letter forms developed under Charlemagne's educational reforms represented divine perfection and spiritual clarity, while Gothic advocates claimed that their compressed, soaring vertical letters reflected humanity's upward spiritual aspirations and made more efficient use of expensive parchment, essentially turning typography into competing theological philosophies. The intellectual battle lines were drawn with the precision of military campaigns. The University of Paris officially endorsed Gothic lettering as representing the future of Christian scholarship, while Oxford University responded by declaring Carolingian script the only acceptable form for serious academic discourse, creating an educational schism that affected everything from diplomatic correspondence to international trade agreements as European institutions chose sides in what had become a continental identity crisis. Brother Raoul of Cluny emerged as the most vocal defender of traditional letter forms, writing passionate treatises arguing that Gothic script's compressed spacing encouraged hurried reading that prevented proper contemplation of sacred texts, while Master Jean de Chelles from Notre Dame countered with equally fervent arguments claiming that Gothic's vertical emphasis drew readers' eyes toward heaven and represented the architectural principles embodied in the great cathedrals that were transforming Europe's spiritual landscape. The conflict gained political dimensions when Emperor Frederick Barbarossa commissioned a manuscript celebrating his military victories specifically in Carolingian script, while King Philip Augustus of France responded by ordering all royal documents produced exclusively in Gothic lettering, transforming a scholarly debate into a matter of national identity and imperial rivalry that affected diplomatic relations between the Holy Roman Empire and France for decades. Regional variations complicated the conflict further. English monasteries developed their own hybrid styles that borrowed elements from both traditions. Spanish scribes incorporated Islamic calligraphic influences that horrified purists on both sides, and Italian communities remained determinately neutral while quietly developing Renaissance letter forms that would eventually make the entire controversy obsolete, creating a complex web of alliances and rivalries that resembled modern political coalitions more than medieval religious cooperation. The economic warfare was immediate and devastating. Monasteries that had collaborated for centuries suddenly canceled existing copying contracts. Wealthy patrons began demanding specific lettering styles before commissioning manuscripts, and international manuscript trade ground to a halt as communities refused to accept payment for books written in rival scripts, creating market disruptions that affected everyone from parchment suppliers to traveling merchants who had built their businesses around intermonastic commerce. The violence, when it finally erupted, was both absurd and genuinely dangerous. The infamous Battle of Scripts at Corby Abbey began when visiting Gothic advocates criticized the monastery's Carolingian psalters during evening prayers, leading to theological arguments that escalated into physical confrontations involving thrown inkwells, broken quills, and at least one documented case of assault with a particularly heavy manuscript that required medical attention for the victim and formal penance for the attacker. Pope Clement III's eventual resolution of the crisis was characteristically diplomatic and completely unsatisfying to everyone involved. His papal bull Literarum Diversitas officially declared both scripts acceptable for religious use while establishing detailed guidelines for when each style should be employed, creating bureaucratic regulations that were so complex and contradictory that most monasteries simply ignored them and continued using whatever lettering they preferred, effectively ending the war through administrative exhaustion rather than theological resolution. The scandal that rocked Citeaux Abbey in 1194 began with what should have been a routine inspection of the monastery's manuscript inventory, but when the papal legate Brother Francesco discovered multiple copies of Ovid's Ars Amatoria hidden beneath altar cloths in the sacristy, followed by complete translations of Arabic medical texts describing human anatomy in unprecedented detail, and most shockingly, several volumes of what appeared to be original Romantic poetry written in the vernacular. Rather than Latin, it became clear that the supposed pillars of Christian scholarship had been operating an underground library that would have made ancient Alexandria proud and would definitely have horrified the church authorities who funded their supposedly sacred copying work. The investigation revealed that Brother Peregrine, the monastery's head librarian and a man renowned throughout Burgundy for his theological expertise, had been systematically using the abbey's resources to copy and preserve secular works that were either officially discouraged, explicitly forbidden, or completely unknown to church authorities, creating a secret collection that included everything from Roman love poetry to Islamic philosophy, Germanic folk tales, mathematical treatises based on Hindu numerals, and most damning of all, vernacular literature that celebrated courtly love, chivalric romance, and other distinctly non-religious themes that directly contradicted monastic vows of celibacy and spiritual detachment from worldly concerns. The scope of the illicit copying operation was staggering. Over 12 years, Brother Peregrine had recruited 17 other monks from various scriptoriums across France, creating a network of scholars who shared forbidden texts, collaborated on translations from Greek and Arabic sources that had been smuggled from Spain and Sicily, and maintained detailed correspondence about intellectual topics that ranged far beyond approved theological discussions, essentially operating a medieval version of an underground university that existed parallel to and hidden within the official religious education system. The economic implications were equally shocking. Church funds intended for copying psalters and gospel books had been diverted to purchase expensive materials for reproducing works by Aristotle, Avicenna, Maimonides, and other authors whose names alone were sufficient to trigger heresy investigations, while the monks had established trading relationships with Jewish scholars in Troyes, Muslim intellectuals in Córdoba, and Byzantine academics in Constantinople, creating an international network of intellectual exchange that completely bypassed official ecclesiastical channels and diplomatic protocols. Brother Peregrine's personal library, discovered hidden in a specially constructed chamber beneath the monastery's wine cellar, contained treasures that would have been worth fortunes in any European capital. Original works by classical authors that were believed lost, complete texts of mathematical and astronomical treatises that existed nowhere else in Western Europe, medical works containing surgical techniques and anatomical knowledge that surpassed anything available in contemporary Christian scholarship, and most remarkably, what appeared to be the only complete Latin translation of several Islamic commentaries on Aristotle that wouldn't be officially available in European universities for another century. The theological defense mounted by the accused monks was intellectually sophisticated and spiritually subversive. They argued that divine truth could be found in all genuine human knowledge regardless of its source, that limiting Christian scholarship to officially approved texts actually hindered rather than helped spiritual development, and that their secret library represented a more complete understanding of God's creation than the deliberately restricted curriculum imposed by church authorities who were more concerned with maintaining control than pursuing genuine wisdom, essentially claiming that their intellectual rebellion was actually a form of religious devotion that served God better than blind obedience to institutional limitations. The wider implications of the discovery sent shockwaves through European monasticism. If the supposedly most orthodox religious communities were secretly pursuing forbidden knowledge, how many other abbeys might be harboring similar collections, and more importantly, how could church authorities maintain intellectual control over institutions that clearly had both the desire and ability to access knowledge sources that operated completely outside official approval systems, creating a crisis of confidence in monastic oversight that required fundamental changes to how religious communities were supervised and regulated. The final resolution was characteristically medieval in its compromise between punishment and pragmatism. The most obviously heretical texts were publicly burned. Brother Peregrine and his collaborators received severe but survivable penances, The secret library was officially dissolved, but many of its less controversial works were quietly transferred to cathedral schools where they could be studied under proper supervision, and new regulations were established requiring detailed inventories of all manuscript copying projects, essentially creating bureaucratic solutions to what was fundamentally an unstoppable human desire for intellectual freedom and scholarly curiosity. The most audacious fraud in medieval manuscript history began in 1203 when Brother Marcellus of Glastonbury Abbey, facing pressure to produce a legendary text that supposedly proved King Arthur's connection to their monastery, decided to simply create the evidence himself rather than disappoint the wealthy Norman nobles who had promised enormous donations in exchange for authentic Arthurian documentation, launching a forgery operation so sophisticated that it fooled scholars for over 4 centuries and established Glastonbury as the premier destination for medieval Dark Age tourism. Marcellus possessed the perfect combination of skills and resources for large-scale historical deception. He was fluent in multiple archaic languages including Old Welsh and primitive Latin scripts, had access to genuinely ancient parchment that had been salvaged from damaged manuscripts, and most importantly, understood exactly what his aristocratic patrons wanted to hear about their supposed connection to Britain's legendary king, allowing him to craft documents that satisfied both their vanity and their need for political legitimacy in a conquered land where Norman authority remained contested. The fabrication process was methodical and brilliant. Marcellus began by studying authentic 6th century manuscripts to master the appropriate letterforms and writing styles, then artificially aged new parchment using techniques involving smoke, tea stains, and carefully controlled moisture that created convincing signs of centuries-old deterioration, while developing inks that matched the chemical composition of genuinely ancient texts by analyzing samples from the monastery's legitimate early Christian documents using methods that wouldn't be surpassed until modern forensic science emerged 700 years later. The content of Marcellus's forged chronicles was carefully designed to be simultaneously spectacular and believable. His discovery of the true history of Arthur Pendragon claimed that Glastonbury had been the legendary Avalon where Arthur recovered from his wounds after the Battle of Camlan, that the monastery possessed Arthur's personal prayer book written in the king's own hand, and most lucratively, that Arthur had granted extensive lands to Glastonbury Abbey in gratitude for the monks' healing services, creating legal documentation that could theoretically support the monastery's claims to disputed territories throughout Somerset and Cornwall. The marketing campaign was as sophisticated as the forgeries themselves. Marcellus arranged for the discovery of these documents to occur during high-profile religious celebrations when influential nobles were visiting the abbey, ensuring maximum witness credibility while creating an atmosphere of divine providence around the finds, then followed up with carefully orchestrated revelations of additional supporting materials that appeared to confirm the initial discoveries while providing increasingly detailed information about Arthur's supposed Christian devotion and his relationship with early British monasticism. The scheme generated enormous profits and international recognition. Pilgrims traveled from across Europe to visit Arthur's supposed final resting place. Wealthy patrons competed to commission manuscripts copying the newly discovered texts, and Glastonbury's reputation as the premier center for Arthurian scholarship attracted scholars, nobles, and clerics whose presence further validated the monastery's claims while generating additional revenue through hospitality services, manuscript copying, fees, and sales of supposed relics connected to the legendary king. The conspiracy expanded beyond Marcellus as other monks were gradually recruited to help maintain the deception. Brother Augustine became expert at creating supporting archaeological evidence by burying appropriately aged artifacts in locations where they would be conveniently discovered. Brother Dunstan specialized in developing complex genealogies that connected contemporary Norman families to Arthurian nobility, and Brother Crispin focused on theological documents that presented Arthur as a proto-Christian king whose legendary activities prefigured later church doctrine, creating a comprehensive fraud that addressed historical, political, and religious interests simultaneously. The psychological aspects of the deception were perhaps most impressive. Marcellus had correctly calculated that his audience wanted desperately to believe in the authenticity of his discoveries, meaning that any doubts about the manuscript's legitimacy would be overwhelmed by wishful thinking, political necessity, and social pressure from peers who had already accepted the documents as genuine, essentially creating a medieval version of confirmation bias that made the fraud self-reinforcing among exactly the people who possessed the authority and resources to expose it. By 1210, news of monastic manuscript scandals had spread far beyond monastery walls and reached the ears of ordinary medieval citizens who discovered that the supposedly holy men responsible for preserving Christian knowledge had been engaging in intellectual fraud, underground libraries, secret competitions, and general chaos that made their own daily struggles with farming, trading, and surviving seem positively dignified by comparison, leading to a popular backlash against monastic authority that manifested in everything from satirical songs to outright rebellion against abbey taxation, and ultimately forced the church to confront the reality that their scholarly institutions had become sources of entertainment rather than spiritual guidance. The reaction in market towns was immediate and merciless. Traveling merchants who had previously treated monks with automatic respect began spreading jokes about abbeys where scribes spent more time writing love poetry than copying gospels, where manuscript competitions resembled tavern brawls, and where the supposed guardians of divine wisdom were apparently less reliable than the average blacksmith when it came to basic honesty and professional competence, creating a popular culture of monastic mockery that undermined centuries of carefully cultivated religious authority. Village storytellers, always eager for new material to entertain audiences during long winter evenings, incorporated tales of incompetent monks into their traditional repertoires alongside stories of foolish kings and clever peasants, creating folk narratives where bumbling scribes replaced traditional authority figures as objects of ridicule, while minstrels composed ballads celebrating ordinary craftsmen whose professional integrity contrasted favorably with the chaotic behavior of supposedly superior religious scholars who couldn't even copy books without starting wars over letter forms. The economic impact was swift and devastating. Wealthy patrons who had previously competed to commission expensive manuscripts from prestigious monasteries began questioning whether their donations were supporting spiritual advancement or subsidizing elaborate practical jokes, leading to significant reductions in funding that forced many scriptoriums to reduce their operations, lay off scribes, and focus on more mundane copying projects that generated steady income rather than spectacular scandals. Local nobles found themselves in the awkward position of having commissioned manuscripts that might contain hidden insults, forged historical claims, or theological errors that could embarrass them in front of peers, or worse, church authorities who were becoming increasingly suspicious of any documentation produced by monastic scriptoriums during the previous decades, leading to expensive authentication processes that required hiring independent scholars to verify the contents and legitimacy of works they had previously accepted without question. The most significant popular response emerged from university towns where students and young scholars who had been excluded from monastic education because of their secular backgrounds suddenly found themselves better informed about current manuscript production scandals than the supposedly learned monks who had previously dismissed them as intellectually inferior, creating generational tensions that accelerated the transfer of scholarly authority from monastic institutions to independent universities that offered more reliable, if less spiritually focused, educational opportunities. Peasant communities, traditionally the most respectful of monastic authority because monks provided essential services including medical care, literacy, and spiritual guidance, began questioning whether institutions that couldn't manage basic book-copying tasks could be trusted with more complex responsibilities, leading to demands for greater transparency in abbey operations and more accountability for how donated resources were actually being used, essentially forcing monasteries to adopt practices that resembled modern nonprofit accountability standards. The satirical literature that emerged from this popular disillusionment was both devastating and surprisingly sophisticated. Anonymous authors produced elaborate parodies of monastic rules that replaced spiritual disciplines with increasingly absurd copying regulations, fictional chronicles that described imaginary scriptoriums where chaos reigned supreme, and mock theological treatises that analyzed the spiritual significance of ink blots, letter spacing, and competitive penmanship with the same scholarly seriousness that real monks applied to genuine religious questions, creating a parallel literature that undermined monastic intellectual authority through intelligent mockery rather than simple ridicule. The long-term cultural impact was profound and permanent. Medieval society's relationship with religious authority shifted from automatic deference to skeptical evaluation. Popular culture became more willing to criticize institutional incompetence regardless of its supposed spiritual status, and ordinary citizens developed confidence in their own judgment about matters that had previously been considered beyond lay understanding, essentially democratizing intellectual authority in ways that prefigured later challenges to church monopolies on education, literacy, and cultural production that would reshape European society over the following centuries. The ultimate irony of medieval manuscript chaos is that their disasters became our greatest treasures. Modern libraries now house thousands of documents that survived precisely because they were too weird, too controversial, or too embarrassing for medieval authorities to destroy completely, creating accidental time capsules that provide more honest insights into daily monastic life than any officially approved chronicle could ever offer, while the marginalia, complaints, and hidden messages that scribes thought were private jokes have become primary historical sources that scholars study with the same intensity once reserved for theological treatises and royal proclamations. Brother Ethelbald's competitive copying war with Godwin, documented through their increasingly elaborate marginalia exchanges, is now preserved in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, where medieval study students analyze their passive-aggressive comments as evidence of workplace psychology in religious communities, while the cursed manuscript from Rievaulx Abbey that drove Brother Thomas to madness was reconstructed from fragments found in multiple locations, suggesting that even after its supposed destruction, parts of the text continued circulating among collectors who were either unaware of its reputation or specifically attracted by its notoriety. Master Hugh's subversive illuminations have become the subject of entire doctoral dissertations and art history programs that examine how medieval artists used religious commissions to express forbidden ideas, while his techniques for hiding secular imagery within sacred contexts influenced Renaissance artists who developed even more sophisticated methods for incorporating controversial content into officially approved works, creating an artistic tradition of coded rebellion that continued for centuries after the original scriptoriums had abandoned manuscript production in favor of printed books. The forged Arthurian documents created by Brother Marcellus at Glastonbury Abbey continued influencing British literature and national identity well into the Renaissance, with writers like Thomas Malory incorporating details from the fabricated chronicles into supposedly authoritative accounts that shaped popular understanding of medieval history for generations. While modern archaeology has confirmed that some of Marcellus's geographical claims were surprisingly accurate despite being invented purely for dramatic effect, suggesting that medieval forgers sometimes created better historical fiction than contemporary writers who had access to genuine sources. The economic records kept by monasteries reveal that manuscript scandals actually increased rather than decreased demand for their services. Wealthy patrons were apparently more interested in owning books with entertaining backstories than perfectly orthodox texts without personality, leading to a medieval market for deliberately controversial manuscripts that resembled modern collectors' preferences for items with provenance that includes scandal, mystery, or celebrity ownership, essentially creating the first documented examples of cultural products that gained value from their association with dysfunction rather than excellence. The linguistic evidence preserved in monastic complaints and marginalia has provided modern scholars with invaluable data about how medieval Latin evolved into vernacular languages. Scribes who thought they were simply venting frustration about working conditions unknowingly documented pronunciation changes, grammatical developments, and vocabulary shifts that would have been impossible to trace through official documents written in formal ecclesiastical Latin, making their personal grumbling sessions accidentally crucial to understanding European linguistic development during one of its most important transitional periods. Perhaps most significantly, the institutional failures of medieval scriptoriums prefigured many challenges that continue affecting educational and cultural organizations today. Problems with quality control, workplace competition, resource allocation, intellectual property, and the tension between individual creativity and institutional conformity appear throughout monastic records in forms so recognizable that modern administrators could probably learn useful lessons from studying how medieval abbots attempted to manage communities of temperamental scholars with access to expensive materials and unlimited opportunities for creative mischief. The manuscripts themselves have achieved a peculiar kind of immortality that their creators never intended. Books that were supposed to be temporary copying jobs have outlasted the monasteries that produced them, the political systems that commissioned them, and the religious traditions that inspired them, while continuing to provide entertainment, education, and insight to audiences who approach them with completely different cultural assumptions and intellectual interests than their original medieval readers, creating an accidental dialogue between centuries that demonstrates both the continuity and dramatic change in human nature, professional relationships, and the eternal struggle between individual expression and institutional control that defines creative work regardless of historical period, technological capabilities, or religious context. Looking back at this bizarre chapter of medieval history, it's almost impossible not to see striking parallels between medieval monk behavior and modern workplace dynamics that make you wonder whether human nature has actually changed at all in the past 1,000 years, or whether we've simply replaced scriptoriums with office cubicles, quill pens with keyboards, and manuscript competitions with productivity metrics while maintaining exactly the same patterns of professional jealousy, creative rebellion, and institutional dysfunction that drove Brother Ethelbald to leave passive-aggressive marginalia for future generations to discover and laugh about. Consider the modern equivalent of monastic manuscript scandals. Corporate employees using company resources for personal projects, office rivalries that escalate into departmental warfare, creative professionals hiding subversive messages in officially approved work, and institutions discovering that their most prestigious divisions have been operating according to completely different standards than anyone in management realized, creating situations where the parallels are so exact that medieval monastic records could probably serve as case studies in contemporary business schools teaching courses on organizational psychology and workplace management. The technology has changed dramatically, but the fundamental human dynamics remain eerily consistent. Medieval monks competing over letterform perfection mirror modern designers obsessing over font choices. Scriptoriums fighting territorial battles over manuscript techniques resemble contemporary tech companies stealing employees and trade secrets. And Brother Hugh's strategy of hiding unauthorized content within approved projects could easily describe how modern artists, writers, and designers incorporate personal statements into commercial work while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Even the superstitions surrounding medieval writing materials have modern equivalents in the elaborate rituals that contemporary creative professionals develop around their tools and work environments. Writers who insist on specific pens or paper types, graphic designers who maintain complex organizational systems for their digital files, and academics who develop seemingly irrational preferences for particular research methods, library locations, or even times of day for productive intellectual work, suggesting that the human need to control uncontrollable creative processes through symbolic behaviors transcends both historical periods and technological capabilities. The bureaucratic response to monastic chaos also prefigures modern institutional attempts to manage creative work through increasingly detailed regulations, quality control procedures, and oversight mechanisms that often generate more problems than they solve. Abbot Godfrey's elaborate inspection protocols could easily be describing contemporary educational assessment systems, corporate compliance requirements, or any other situation where administrators attempt to quantify and control processes that are fundamentally resistant to standardization, measurement, and external evaluation. Perhaps most tellingly, the popular reaction to monastic manuscript scandals mirrors contemporary public responses to institutional failures. The same mixture of fascination and disappointment that medieval citizens felt when discovering their supposedly noble religious scholars were engaged in petty competitions and professional fraud appears whenever modern audiences learn about dysfunction in universities, corporations, government agencies, or other institutions that claim special authority, based on expertise, moral superiority, or exclusive access to important knowledge or resources. The entertainment value that modern audiences find in medieval monastic chaos probably says something significant about our continuing need to see powerful institutions and their representatives revealed as fallibly human rather than intimidatingly superior. Just as medieval peasants enjoyed stories about incompetent monks, contemporary culture seems to derive satisfaction from discovering that prestigious institutions are staffed by people who make exactly the same kinds of mistakes, harbor the same petty jealousies, and engage in the same creative workarounds that characterize ordinary human behavior in any organized setting. The ultimate lesson might be that expecting any group of creative individuals to function as a smoothly efficient institution is fundamentally unrealistic regardless of historical period, religious motivation, or technological resources. Whether you're organizing medieval monks to copy manuscripts or modern professionals to produce digital content, you're essentially trying to manage creative personalities who have their own ideas about how things should be done, limited patience for bureaucratic oversight, and unlimited capacity for finding innovative ways to subvert systems that don't accommodate their individual preferences, professional ambitions, and basic human need for autonomy, recognition, and creative expression that transcends any particular institutional context or historical moment. So what's the moral of our journey through medieval manuscript mayhem? Perhaps it's that humans have always been exactly as petty, competitive, creative, and gloriously dysfunctional as we are today, except medieval people had the advantage of preserving their workplace drama in permanent ink on expensive parchment, ensuring that future generations would have front-row seats to witness their professional meltdowns, personal grudges, and creative rebellions in exquisite calligraphic detail that makes their chaos infinitely more entertaining than our digital equivalents that disappear into deleted email folders and forgotten hard drives. The deeper truth might be that every time we put creative people in institutional settings with rigid rules, expensive materials, and competitive pressures, we're essentially conducting the same experiment that medieval monasteries ran for centuries, and we keep getting the same results. Brilliant work mixed with personal drama, innovation combined with institutional resistance, and professional excellence coexisting with behavior that would make reality television producers weep with joy at. The untapped entertainment potential. Brother Ethelbald's obsessive perfectionism, Master Hugh's artistic rebellion, and Brother Marcellus's elaborate fraud schemes weren't anomalies or signs of medieval moral decay. They were perfectly predictable outcomes of putting talented individuals in environments where their personal success depends on satisfying institutional requirements that may or may not align with their creative instincts, professional ambitions, or basic human need for recognition, autonomy, and the occasional opportunity to tell their supervisors exactly what they think without facing immediate termination or eternal damnation. The modern workplace might benefit from adopting medieval marginalia as an official communication method. Imagine if contemporary employees could leave anonymous comments in the margins of corporate reports, marketing materials, or policy documents, creating a parallel conversation that revealed what people actually thought about their work environment, management decisions, and institutional priorities, though admittedly this system would probably generate more workplace therapy requirements than medieval monasteries ever needed, since modern professionals might be less emotionally equipped to handle centuries-old complaints about their penmanship preserved for posterity. Perhaps the most encouraging lesson is that institutional dysfunction doesn't necessarily prevent excellent work. Despite all their chaos, medieval scriptoriums produced manuscripts that remain artistic and intellectual treasures nearly 1,000 years later, suggesting that creativity often flourishes precisely in environments where people have enough freedom to develop personal styles, enough competition to push their capabilities, and enough institutional support to access high-quality materials and techniques, even if the management structure resembles a cross between summer camp and psychological warfare. The fact that we continue to find medieval monastic behavior both shocking and familiar suggests that human nature operates within fairly consistent parameters regardless of historical context. We want to do meaningful work, we want recognition for our efforts, we want some degree of creative control over our output, and we want to work with people who share our standards and values, but we also inevitably end up in situations where these perfectly reasonable desires conflict with institutional requirements, interpersonal dynamics, and the simple reality that other people are trying to satisfy their own equally reasonable but potentially incompatible needs and preferences. In the end, maybe the real treasure wasn't the manuscripts they copied along the way, but the friendships they destroyed through competitive penmanship, the institutional authority they undermined through creative rebellion, and the centuries of entertainment they provided for future generations who would discover their preserved workplace drama and realize that human beings have always been exactly as complicated, talented, frustrating, and ultimately endearing as the people we encounter in our own professional lives, except with better handwriting and significantly more dramatic consequences for minor theological disagreements. The medieval monks who spent their nights copying books by candlelight thought they were preserving divine wisdom for future generations, but what they actually preserved was something far more valuable. Evidence that human creativity, ambition, and community remain fundamentally unchanged across centuries, technologies, and belief systems, creating connections between past and present that remind us that every workplace is really just another scriptorium where people with talent, ego, and access to tools are trying to create something meaningful while simultaneously dealing with all the interpersonal complexity that makes collaborative creative work both rewarding and completely insane. If you think medieval monks were chaotic, wait until you discover what happened when royal courts decided they needed their own private scriptoriums to handle diplomatic correspondence, legal documents, and the kind of sensitive political communications that couldn't be trusted to monasteries that had proven themselves incapable of maintaining professional standards, basic confidentiality, or even elementary workplace civility because apparently kings and queens looked at the manuscript. Scandals we've just explored and thought to themselves, surely we can do better than those incompetent religious amateurs who spend their time writing curse words in the margins of sacred texts. Royal scribes operated under completely different pressures than their monastic counterparts. Instead of worrying about spiritual contamination and theological accuracy, they had to navigate court politics where a single miscopied word in a treaty could start wars, where rival nobles would pay enormous bribes for advance copies of royal proclamations, and where the difference between accurate documentation and politically convenient interpretation could determine whether entire families lived. in luxury or died in dungeons, creating workplace stress levels that made monastic competition look like friendly academic disagreement. The Palace of Westminster maintained a scriptorium that employed over 60 professional scribes whose primary job was producing the endless stream of charters, patents, writs, and diplomatic correspondence required to run a medieval kingdom, but whose secondary job apparently involved the most elaborate system of political espionage, document falsification, and bureaucratic sabotage in European history, because when your livelihood depends on government employment and your government changes hands through military conquest, assassination, and dynastic warfare, job security becomes a very creative concept that requires flexible ethical standards. Court records from the reign of King John reveal that royal scribes were regularly bribed by foreign ambassadors to insert subtle changes into treaty negotiations, paid by domestic nobles to alter the wording of tax assessments, and blackmailed by church authorities who threatened to reveal their unauthorized copying of banned political treatises, creating a workplace environment where professional advancement required skills in forgery, extortion, and international intrigue that would impress modern intelligence agencies while simultaneously maintaining the calligraphic excellence and administrative efficiency expected by royal patrons who considered execution a reasonable response to clerical errors. The story gets even stranger when we examine the competition between different royal scriptoriums. The English court tried to poach talented scribes from French palaces by offering better working conditions and immunity from prosecution for previous political crimes, while the French responded by establishing elaborate spy networks designed to steal English diplomatic techniques and discover which royal documents were being forged, authentic, or deliberately misleading, essentially turning international diplomacy into an extended game of bureaucratic warfare where the weapons were quill pens and the battlefield was official correspondence. But the most incredible part of this story involves a royal scribe named William de Braose who may have single-handedly altered the course of English history through a combination of political forgery, diplomatic manipulation, and record-keeping that was so sophisticated that historians are still discovering documents he modified, created, or destroyed in service of political agendas that we're only beginning to understand, making Brother Marcellus's Arthurian forgeries look like amateur hour, compared to the systematic institutional deception practiced by professional government employees. Next time, we'll explore how royal scriptoriums became the medieval equivalent of intelligence agencies, how court scribes developed techniques for invisible ink that weren't rediscovered until the 20th century, how diplomatic correspondence became an elaborate code system that concealed as much as it revealed, and how the race to control information through superior copying technology ultimately contributed to political developments that shaped modern European nation-states, because apparently every attempt to professionalize manuscript production just created new opportunities for creative chaos, institutional dysfunction, and historical entertainment that makes contemporary political scandals seem positively boring by comparison, proving that human ingenuity for turning serious responsibilities into complicated disasters remains one of our most consistent and endearing characteristics across centuries, cultures, and governmental systems. And so we reach the end of our journey through the candlelit corridors of medieval scriptoriums, where we discovered that Brother Ethelbald's ink-stained fingers and competitive spirit were just the beginning of a world far more complex, chaotic, and hilariously human than anyone ever imagined, because what started as a simple story about monks copying books by candlelight revealed an entire universe of workplace drama, institutional dysfunction, creative rebellion, and professional chaos that proves our ancestors were exactly as complicated, petty, brilliant, and entertainingly dysfunctional as we are today, except they preserved their chaos in beautiful calligraphy that survived long enough for us to discover and appreciate their very human struggles with authority, competition, perfectionism, and the eternal challenge of trying to do meaningful creative work within institutional systems that don't always understand or support individual talent and ambition. From Brother Ethelbald's legendary penmanship wars to Master Hugh's subversive illuminations, from the cursed manuscript that drove Brother Thomas to madness to the papal intervention required to end the Great War of Letter Styles, from the underground libraries of forbidden knowledge to the elaborate forgery schemes that created national myths, we've seen that medieval monasteries weren't peaceful havens of spiritual contemplation but rather dynamic, competitive, occasionally destructive communities where talented individuals pushed boundaries, challenged authorities, and created works of lasting beauty while simultaneously engaging in behavior that would provide entertainment for historians nearly 1,000 years later. The marginalia they left behind tells the real story. Complaints about cold weather and borrowed pens, sarcastic comments about incompetent supervisors, elaborate curses directed at workplace thieves, and personal observations about everything from local politics to monastic food quality, creating an accidental record of daily medieval life that's more honest, detailed, and entertaining than any official chronicle could ever be, while simultaneously demonstrating that human nature transcends historical periods, technological capabilities, and institutional contexts in ways that make these ancient voices feel surprisingly contemporary and familiar. If this hidden world of medieval manuscript chaos has captured your imagination, you're going to love exploring the equally bizarre stories that emerge when we examine other supposedly dignified medieval institutions that turned out to be just as chaotic, competitive, and creatively dysfunctional as the scriptoriums we've discovered tonight. Because medieval Europe was apparently filled with communities of talented individuals who combined professional excellence with personal drama in ways that created both lasting cultural treasures and centuries of entertaining historical evidence about the eternal struggle between human creativity and institutional control. Consider subscribing if you want to continue this journey into the secret lives of medieval professionals who thought they were simply doing their jobs but accidentally created some of the most fascinating, funny, and surprisingly relatable workplace documentation in human history, because there are dozens of similar stories waiting to be uncovered in the archives of medieval guilds, royal courts, university towns, and trading centers where ambitious individuals with access to expensive materials and competitive colleagues created the same kinds of professional drama that continues to characterize creative work today, except with higher stakes, more elaborate revenge schemes, and significantly better preservation methods that allow us to enjoy their conflicts from the comfortable distance of several centuries. The medieval world wasn't the dark, ignorant, spiritually focused place we often imagine, but rather a dynamic, intellectually curious, highly competitive society where people pursued excellence, innovation, and personal advancement with the same intensity that drives modern professionals, except they did it by candlelight in stone buildings while wearing robes and maintaining elaborate pretenses about religious devotion that barely concealed their very human desires for recognition, creative freedom, and the occasional opportunity to tell their supervisors exactly what they thought about institutional policies that interfered with quality work, creating historical records that are simultaneously informative about medieval culture and surprisingly therapeutic for anyone who has ever worked in a creative field with demanding clients, competitive colleagues, and management that doesn't always understand the complexities involved in producing excellent work under pressure. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that human creativity, ambition, and workplace dysfunction have remained remarkably consistent across centuries, and that somewhere in a medieval monastery scriptorium, Brother Ethelbald is probably still competing with someone about letterform perfection while leaving passive-aggressive marginalia for future generations to discover and appreciate, because the more things change, the more they stay exactly the same, and the best historical stories are always the ones that remind us that our ancestors were just as talented, petty, brilliant, and entertainingly human as we are today.